Hey, everybody, welcome back to the show for today. I'm really excited because when we produce this show, we've got a lot of different topics that we kick around, and we've got a great team of college finance experts. And they come up with these awesome financial aid segments every single week that we get to bring to you. And they've thought about it a little bit big picture over the next three shows, which is that we're going to be talking a little bit about financial aid in three segments. And that's because Michelle Richardson, you're here today, and you're one of our favorite guests on the finance side for the radio show. So I'm glad to have you. You should say hello, though, because this is an audio medium. I always assume like it's video. Hi, Michelle. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thanks so much. And it's great to be here. Happy to be on the show.
I'm glad to have you. So you were just saying and reminding me that, of course, this is the time when seniors are starting to think about paying for college, because as the decisions are coming back, they're also getting financial aid offers from the schools they've been admitted to. It's also the time when juniors are starting to make decisions about what their college list is going to look like. And the financial implications of choosing different sets of colleges are really important. And so you and your team have put together a three-part segment on financial aid starting this week, where we're just going to define different aspects of aid and make sure that people have a sense of what's out there. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit about how financial aid is determined and some of that calculation, what goes into the award letters and notifications. And then we will talk about how financial aid offices provide assistance for students as that first line of support once they become students on a particular college campus. Is that about right? That's what we're doing.
Absolutely perfect. It's such a broad topic. We can't cover it all in one segment. So we really tried to break it down into timely sections.
And I think it's also one of the real difficulties of this kind of conversation is that everybody's circumstances are really different and specific. And so when you're speaking to an audience like ours, we love our listeners here, but they're all different in terms of what their needs and expectations are. So we're going to try and hit them all with some great content. Just to start, let's go with the basics. What is financial aid? Michelle, you're on the clock.
All right. Thanks so much, Ian. Yeah. In a nutshell, financial aid is both, it's really all things paying for college, all items used to pay for college. Some of them are considered need-based, which means that, families have to go through the financial aid application process and their financial need is determined. However, there are also, I think it's very important for families who may not qualify for need-based financial aid to understand that the term of financial aid really encompasses all things paying for college.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Because I think people do often think, well, we're not going to qualify for financial aid. And I think that talks to one narrow kind of aid, but there are a lot of different other ways of getting financial support in college. And your team is focused on understanding all of the different components of financial aid. Now,
right.
Why do families need to know this? I mean, why is it so important to remind families that it's not just about your finances and that formula?
Sure. Well, I think one of the most important things that we all recognize is college is a major investment and an expense. And so as families, regardless of whether, they're younger in the high school or now they're seniors and they're getting those financial aid notifications back and realizing we've got a big chunk to cover here. Mm-hmm. And so, and again, I think it's very important for families to know, if we want to look at statistics, for example, basically 84% of full-time undergraduate students receive some sort of financial aid. And that is based on all the data that the schools provide to the Department of Education. Wow. And that was from 3 years ago, because that's as recent as we get that type of data. So it may even be higher than that now. And I also think it's important for college-bound students and families to better understand financial aid so they understand what it encompasses, and to your point earlier, to set realistic expectations. Because financial aid is so broad and covers so many aspects, we do have those families that are like, I'm not going to qualify for financial aid. But again, remember that there are financial aid components that aren't based on financials, even though it's really considered, financial aid.
That's right. Yeah. And I think getting to some of those definitions is really helpful because people think about financial aid as a discount on their tuition or just a check that they get in the mail. But I think that there are different types of financial aid that are out there. Do you want to help explain some of those different types of aid that people can receive?
Sure. So I'll cover grants and scholarships. That's like the number one go-to. Everybody
Sure.
loves grants and scholarships, right? Because
Yeah.
it's free money. And to your point, it is a way that schools will often reduce their directly billed costs, like tuition.
Hmm.
So schools, oftentimes will offer a grant or a scholarship or both in order to reduce that cost. A lot of, in deciphering the two, we get a lot of questions on, what's the difference between a grant and a scholarship? Really, grants typically have a financial need component attached to them.
Mm.
So
Okay.
financial aid grants or need-based grants are usually determined by the schools and based on their methodologies.
Yeah.
And families have to provide financial information to determine grants. Scholarships are, for the most part, there are some scholarships that are based on need, but typically like the merit scholarships that schools offer are typically not based on a family's ability or inability to pay.
Right.
Financial aid also encompasses, and it may sound, and I think this is why it's confusing for families, it also encompasses financing like loans.
Right.
People don't consider, as consumers, I don't consider if I go to my bank and get a car loan that's really financial aid. However,
It,
I think it is
yeah.
important for families to know that if they want their student to have access to like a federal student loan, you have to go through the financial aid application process, and schools consider all things, financing related, student loans, parent loans, private loans, part of their financial aid, package. Also, finally, another component of financial aid is we hear the term federal work study.
Hmm.
And, there's a question on the FAFSA that will ask if students want to, be considered for work study. And so it's like, well, what is work study? Federal work study is a way and is need-based financial aid by definition, because the federal government provides funding to the schools in order to employ students that have financial need on their campus. So that's considered, federal work study, which is different than, standard student employment on
Yeah.
campus, which is not part of financial aid.
Yeah, there's so many different moving parts here. And you can see, I mean, as you're talking about this, I'm thinking about all of the rules and regulations that went into place to think about this and what colleges want, what families want, what the government might want to provide, what the expense is in terms of taxpayers. There's a lot of different moving parts here. I think one thing that I think that would be really important to just acknowledge is if you're admitted to a college, you're a great student, right? And so like some students will say, well, I didn't get a merit scholarship. That other student has a need-based scholarship. But I wouldn't say that's a difference in terms of deserving of financial aid. They're just different forms of aid depending on where you're coming from and what your circumstances are. And institutions make choices, right, about how they want to incentivize students to attend and how they want to support different groups of students in choosing them. But everybody who's admitted to a college is somebody that college really wants to have on campus. So it's always, we got to pause and acknowledge that just in case families
Absolutely.
are curious. So, all right, you talked about grants and scholarships a little bit. The work study question, I think, is kind of interesting because I remember having friends on campus who worked jobs. I worked a job on campus, even though I wasn't a part of a federal work study program. I was an intern in the college admission office and was a tour guide there. But I had friends who worked in the sports center or who drove the night bus or who worked in the library. What is the difference between that student employment versus a work study program from a student's perspective?
Sure. So work study, and oftentimes it's called federal work study.
Okay.
And again, schools are provided a pool of funds from the federal government in order to help employ students who have financial need on that campus to get jobs. So work study, if you will see federal work study on your financial aid award notification, that means that you qualified from a need-based perspective based on the government's definition and application that you would qualify to apply for and get a part-time job on campus. And that program is considered need-based because part of it is federally funded.
I got you.
Whereas student employment, or sometimes schools will refer to it as just work study, not federal work study.
Yeah.
But then that would all be funded by the institution, and students typically don't need to show financial aid eligibility or complete the federal financial aid application in order to be considered for standard student employment.
So the money comes from different sources, right? So like when I worked in the admission office, there was an admission office budget item for student workers, and that's how I was paid. But sometimes federal work study is going to come from the federal government. That's a different source that goes to students. What about the way that the money ultimately hits the student? I got a paycheck, but for students that are on federal work study, does that money come straight to them, or does it go to the institution to support the cost of their tuition?
Yep, great question. It is just typically on most campuses, it's just like student employment, and you get a paycheck. So when I went to college, many, many years ago, I qualified for federal work study. And so I had a job on campus, and I was paid through payroll, just like my roommate who had a part-time job on campus, but hers wasn't federal work study. So she, didn't have to fill out the application, the federal financial aid application, and basically qualify for that access to that position by demonstrating financial need.
But when it came time for you all to go out to dinner on the weekends, you were splitting the check with money that you both got in your pockets at the end of the day, even though they came from different sources.
Correct. And yeah, and I think that kind of oftentimes will get asked, where does where does financial aid come from?
Yeah.
And what resources fund financial aid? I think a big misconception out there is that the federal government pumps all this money into financial aid. I think a good, and this is kind of where the expectations come, the federal government does have a couple grant programs, but predominantly their biggest way of providing financial aid is through student loans or parent loans. Right. The biggest resource for financial aid really comes from the colleges and universities themselves, which is, what we talk about all the time when trying to maximize merit scholarships or look at schools that maybe offer more need-based for those families that do have financial aid eligibility.
That's actually a great place to leave it, and a really nice teaser for next week, because for next week's session, we're talking about how that financial aid is determined by schools, how they're going to make choices about who gets what kind of funding. So that's an awesome segue. Of course it is, because you came up with this idea for this 3-week segment on financial aid. Are there any other things that you wanted to make sure that, just as like an initial primer, that people have for today going into the show that they might hear next week?
So I think the one thing, especially for seniors, if you haven't applied for financial aid or, thought maybe you wouldn't qualify, talk with the financial aid office and see, so you better understand what their what their rules are. And also, I think the one thing to recognize when we talk about financial aid, it's not just need-based. It also encompasses scholarships, whether they come from the schools or even outside entities,
Yeah.
and also financing, which, like I said earlier, many of us would not consider a student loan or a parent loan, financial aid, but in essence, it really is.
But really similar to buying a house, man. I can't buy a house with cash. I need help in order to do that. It happens to be that I'm doing that through a loan from a bank and a mortgage. That is aid, even though I
Correct.
hate making those payments every
Don't we
month.
all?
It is aid, right? So
Mhm.
so it's an important thing, I think, to acknowledge how that can help to support achieving this goal of wanting to get that higher education, if that's something that your family is interested in.
Absolutely.
Sweet. Thanks, Michelle. This was great. February is Financial Aid Awareness Month. We know that because February starts with F, and so does financial aid, right? So just everybody can remember that and have conversations with your friends and family. Refer them to this podcast so you can hear all about it from experts like Michelle. Thanks for coming on the show, Michelle. Really appreciate it.
Hey, you're welcome. My pleasure. Take
Uh,
care.
all right. When we come back, we are going to talk about comic books. That's right, comic books. You won't want to miss it.